year is 1066. The thunder of boots shakes the fields of England, and warriors clad in steel march toward their fate. On one side stands King Harald Hardrada of Norway, the last great Viking king, a man whose name alone strikes fear across Europe. On the other side, an English army under Harald Godwinson, defending its homeland from invasion. What unfolds at Stamford Bridge will not just decide the fate of a kingdom, it will mark the end of the Viking Age itself. Welcome back, traveler, to another journey through history. Today, we bring you to the twilight of the Vikings, when the storm of the north finally calmed, and an age of warriors, raiders, and explorers met its final reckoning. If you have followed our saga through the rise, glory, and struggles of the Norsemen, stay with us now for their ultimate chapter, the dramatic fall of the Viking Age. To understand the fall, we must first understand the man who embodied the last great Viking dream, Harald Hardrada. Born in 1015, Harald Sigurdsson was the half-brother of Olaf II of Norway, later Saint Olaf. As a teenager, Harald fought beside his brother in battle, but was forced into exile after Olaf's defeat at Stiklestad in 1030. Exiled, but not defeated, Harald carried with him the burning fire of ambition, a restless spirit that would see him travel far beyond the fjords of Norway, across rivers, seas, and empires. Wherever Harald went, legends followed. He fought as a mercenary in Kiev and Rus, carving his reputation as a hardened warrior. He journeyed south to Constantinople, where he became a commander in the elite Byzantine Varangian Guard, the feared Norse bodyguards of the emperor himself. There, he battled in Sicily, in the Holy Land, and across the Mediterranean, his axe and sword gaining him both riches and scars. Some called him the Thunderbolt of the North, a man of unmatched courage and ferocity. When Harald finally returned to Norway in 1046, he returned not as an exile, but as a seasoned warlord, wealthy, experienced, and burning with ambition to claim the throne. Together with Magnus the Good, son of his brother Olaf, he co-ruled Norway. When Magnus died the following year, Harald became the sole king. For 2 decades, Harald Hardrada ruled Norway with an iron hand. He crushed opposition, expanded his power, and dreamed of uniting Scandinavia under his rule. Yet his eyes were always set beyond Norway. For Harald, destiny pointed west, across the North Sea, to the rich lands of England. England in the mid-11th century was a kingdom of shifting powers. King Edward the Confessor ruled, but with no heir, rival claims were already brewing. The powerful Earl Harald Godwinson sought the throne, but Harald Hardrada, with Viking blood and royal claims through earlier treaties, also believed England should be his. And in the shadows, another figure waited, Duke William of Normandy, who would later be called the Conqueror. The stage was set for 1066, the year that would change Europe forever, the invasion of England. In September of that year, Harald Hardrada launched his great gamble. With around 300 ships and nearly 10,000 warriors, Norwegians, Icelanders, and allies from across the north, he sailed toward the English coast. His ally, Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of Harald Godwinson, joined him. Tostig had been cast out of England by his brother, and in betrayal, he pledged support to the Norwegian king. Together, they sought to seize England by force. The fleet swept into the Humber estuary, striking fear into northern England. They advanced to York, where on September 20th, they met the English earls Edwin and Mercar at the Battle of Fulford. The clash was brutal, with shields splintering and the air filled with the roar of war horns. Hardrada's men, seasoned and disciplined, crushed the English earls, leaving hundreds dead in the marshy ground. York surrendered, and victory seemed within Harold's grasp. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans. Harald Godwinson's response. King Harald Godwinson of England, far to the south, had been preparing for another invasion, one expected from William of Normandy. Yet when word reached him of Hardrada's northern strike, Harald acted with astonishing speed. Gathering his housecarls and levies, he marched his army nearly 200 miles north in less than a week, a feat of endurance that still amazes historians. His men, exhausted but resolute, arrived near York on September 25th. Hardrada, meanwhile, awaited hostages and supplies from York, believing the English king was still far away. The Vikings rested near Stamford Bridge, some without armor, enjoying the fruits of their victory. It was there, on that fateful morning, that Harold Godwinson's army appeared on the horizon. The clash that followed would echo across centuries. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, September 25, 1066. The fields around Stamford Bridge shimmer in the early autumn sun. What should have been a day of rest and celebration for Harald Hardrada's men turned suddenly into a day of reckoning. As the English army crested the hills, the Vikings at first thought they were farmers, or perhaps a scouting party. But soon the full scale of the host became clear. Harold Godwinson had brought thousands of warriors, housecarls clad in mail, fyrdsmen carrying spears and axes, banners fluttering in the wind. He had caught the Norwegians completely by surprise. Hardrada's army, many unarmored and spread out, scrambled to form ranks. They hastily erected a shield wall, the legendary Viking defense, near the river crossing. And here, one of the most enduring legends of Stamford Bridge was born. According to the sagas, a single giant of a Norse warrior held the narrow wooden bridge against the English advance. With axe in hand, he cut down dozens who tried to pass, buying precious time for his comrades to regroup. Some said it took a spear thrust from beneath the bridge, driven up through the planks, to finally bring him down. Whether truth or myth, the tale embodies the Viking spirit, fierce defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. With the bridge cleared, the English surged forward. The battle raged across the meadows, a brutal collision of shield walls, spears, and axes. Harald Hardrada, towering in stature and clad in a blue tunic, commanded from the front lines. He was a king who led not from behind, but with sword in hand. His voice thundered over the clash, rallying his men with the promise of glory and the old Norse dream of Valhalla. But fate struck swiftly. In the thick of fighting, an arrow pierced Hardrada's throat. The mighty king of Norway, who had fought in lands from Byzantium to Jerusalem, who had dreamed of ruling England, fell on the battlefield of Stamford Bridge. His death sent shockwaves through the Viking ranks. Toasted Godwinson, ever ambitious, tried to seize command. But the English pressed harder, and the Norwegians, trapped and weary, began to falter. Though reinforcements from the ships eventually arrived, they were too late, too scattered. The Viking host was cut down, surrounded, and shattered. By sunset, the meadows were littered with the fallen. Of the vast Norwegian fleet of 300 ships, only a few dozen were needed to carry the survivors back across the North Sea. The Viking dream of conquering England had died with Harald Hardrada. Aftermath of Stamford Bridge. The battle was catastrophic for Norway. Thousands of its finest warriors lay dead. The bloodline of Viking kings who had dreamed of empire in the West was broken. In England, Harold Godwinson had won a stunning victory, defending his realm from the Norse invaders. Yet victory came at a terrible cost. His army was exhausted, bloodied, and still far from home. For Harold, destiny had one more cruel twist in store. Even as he celebrated his triumph over Hardrada, news reached him. Duke William of Normandy had landed on the southern coast. The English king was forced to march his battered forces all the way back south, straight into the Battle of Hastings and into history's pages, where William the Conqueror would claim the English throne. But for the Vikings, Stamford Bridge was more than a lost battle. It was the closing of an era. Never again would a great Scandinavian army invade England. Never again would the thunder of dragon ships strike fear across Europe's shores in the same way. the age of Viking raids and conquests was over. The legacy of Harald Hardrada. Yet Harald Hardrada's story did not vanish into obscurity. In the sagas and chronicles, he became remembered as the last great Viking. His life embodied the spirit of the Norse adventurer, exile, mercenary, conqueror, king. He had fought in the east, ruled in the north, and died seeking a kingdom in the west. Historians often describe him as a man born in the wrong century, a warrior of the old Viking tradition, living at the dawn of a new medieval world where centralized kingdoms, castles, and heavy cavalry were replacing the raiders of old. Harald's death symbolized not just the end of one man's ambition, but the passing of an entire age. The Viking Age fades. By the late 11th century, the world was changing. Scandinavia itself had been transformed. Christianity had spread across Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, replacing the old gods of Odin, Thor, and Freya with the cross. Kings were consolidating power, ending the era when independent jarls could raise fleets and raid across seas at will. Trade, diplomacy, and feudal structures were replacing the longships and axes of earlier centuries. In England, the Norman conquest reshaped the kingdom permanently, tying it to continental Europe and altering its culture, language, and nobility. In the north, Scandinavian kingdoms turned inward, building monarchies that looked more like their European neighbors than the raiding bands of old. Still, echoes of the Viking spirit endured. Their seafaring legacy lived on in trade routes and exploration. Their sagas preserved the memory of heroes and voyages, and their descendants left lasting marks on the lands they had once raided, from the Danelaw of England to the Duchy of Normandy, founded by Viking settlers generations earlier. But the age of Viking dominance, of sudden raids and kings like Harald Hardrada, seeking thrones across the sea, had ended at Stamford Bridge. The wider impact of 1066. The fall of Harald Hardrada and the Battle of Stamford Bridge did not just alter Norway or England, it reshaped Europe. For centuries, Viking longships had been the nightmare of monasteries, villages, and coastal kingdoms. From the rivers of Russia to the shores of France, from Ireland to the Mediterranean, the Norsemen had been both destroyers and creators. Raiders and settlers, feared and admired. But after 1066, their power waned. The fleets that once carried warriors now carried merchants. The gods of Asgard gave way to Christendom, and with that shift came new alliances and new wars, fought under banners of kings rather than chieftains. The world of medieval Europe, with knights, castles, and kingdoms, had replaced the world of jarls, longships, and sagas. And yet, though the Viking Age ended, its fingerprints remained everywhere. The Viking legacy across Europe. In England, Viking influence endured in place names, in language, and in law. Words like sky, law, husband, and window still echo Old Norse roots. Regions once ruled under the Danelaw carried traces of Norse culture long after Stamford Bridge. Even the Normans who conquered England owed their origins to Viking settlers in northern France, descendants of Rollo, the Viking chieftain who became Duke of Normandy in the early 10th century. In Ireland, towns like Dublin, Limerick, and Waterford had been established by Norse traders and settlers, leaving legacies that still stand today. In Russia, the Varangians, who had once sailed down the great rivers, laid the foundations of states that would later evolve into powerful kingdoms. And in Iceland, Greenland, and even North America, the spirit of exploration lived on in the sagas of Leif Erikson and his kin. Though the Vikings as conquerors faded, the world they had touched could never erase them. The transformation of Scandinavia. For Scandinavia itself, the centuries after 1066 were a turning point. Norway, Denmark, and Sweden became Christian kingdoms with dynasties and monarchies that resembled those of continental Europe. Churches rose where temples to Odin once stood. Monasteries and towns replaced longhouses and pagan groves. But beneath this new Christian order, the memory of the old gods lingered. In rural areas, people still whispered of Thor's hammer and the thunder, or of Odin's watchful eye. The sagas, eventually written down in Iceland, preserved the myths and histories that had shaped the Viking worldview. These stories would echo across generations, keeping alive the memory of the age when the Northmen ruled the seas. The symbolism of Stamford Bridge. And so, when we look back to Stamford Bridge, it stands not only as a military defeat, but as a symbolic ending. It was the last great attempt of the Vikings to carve out an empire abroad. The death of Harald Hardrada was the death of the Viking Age itself, a dramatic curtain fall on nearly 3 centuries of adventure, conquest, and legend. From Lindisfarne in 793 to Stamford Bridge in 1066, the saga of the Vikings had spanned almost 300 years. They began as raiders, became rulers, and finally transformed into something else entirely, part of the broader fabric of medieval Europe. Their age was over, but their legacy was immortal. And so ends our saga of the Vikings, a people who carved their names in fire, steel, and story across the pages of history. From their first raids on English shores to the fall of Harald Hardrada at Stamford Bridge, theirs was an age of courage, brutality, faith, and transformation. The Viking Age is gone, but not forgotten. It lingers in our languages, in our cities, in our legends. And in every storm at sea, in every restless dream of adventure, the echo of the Northmen endures. If you've traveled with us through this epic journey, from the rise of the raiders to the fall of their last great king, then join our shield wall and stand with us. Strike the like button as if it were the clash of steel. Subscribe so that you never miss another saga of the past. And share this tale with fellow travelers so the story of the North never fades into silence. For history is a long ship on an endless sea, and we are all its voyagers. Until next time, may the winds of the past guide your way.